So let's talk about perception. The first thing we need to know about perception is that naturally we are not as perceptive as we think we are. So our brains are bombarded with 11 million bits of information per second. That's with all of our five senses, with everything that we take in. 11 bits of information, or 11 million rather, bits of information per second, but we only attend to 40 bits. So 11 million, 40. That's basically how unperceptive we are. So the first thing when we come into thinking about perception and learning about the perception, we have a lot of work to do. And what that leads to is unintentional blindness, which means we're not trying not to be perceptive, we just are. And so we really have to work on controlling our brain a little bit more to attend to the things that we need to perceive. Again, we have so many distractions, whether that's our phone, whether that's other people, all kinds of social media technology, whatever else. And it's become even more difficult in 2022 to really pay attention to everything that's going on around us. So we need to work at that much more. So one of the main ways that perception affects us is through our self-concept. Our self-concept is a social construction, which basically means the way that we perceive ourselves is based on the feedback that we get from other people. So if we feel pretty good about ourselves, that's affected in some degree by the positive feedback that we get from other people. If we don't feel good about ourselves, that's affected in some way by the negative that we get from other people. Now, it's not all that, and I'm not saying that at all, but it is a big part of the way that we perceive ourselves. And it's basically a reflected appraisal. We learn who we are by figuring out who we aren't. So that perception, we tend to be hyper-perceptive about ourselves and what other people think of us, and that affects basically how we act. And so our self-perception tends to go to extremes. First of all, we have body image, and so we tend to look at ourselves negatively a lot of times with our body image. So females tend to think they're too big and they want to get smaller. Males think they're smaller and want to get bigger. And there are really some extreme examples of this. They've had studies where they've studied women with anorexia, and they're just super, super thin, but they say they look in the mirror and think they're fat. And then they'll study men who are bodybuilders, and they'll look at themselves in the mirror and say, well, this muscle group is way too small, even though they're massive individuals. But then on the opposite side of that, sometimes we're victims of the self-serving bias, which basically means in our brains, if something goes wrong, it's somebody else's fault. If something goes well, it's 100% us. And so that perception that we have kind of goes to extremes. And really what we need to do is find ourselves in the middle with our self-perception. But those are the kind of things that are going on in our brains on top of the feedback that we're getting from other people that all affect our self-perception. And so really the way that we perceive others starts with the way that we perceive ourselves. So in order to perceive others better, we have to really work on our self-perception, because once we have our self-perception in a really healthy light, then that helps us be more empathetic when we perceive others. So let's talk about the way we perceive others. So we perceive, or we make judgments about people and objects when we first see them within a tenth of a second. So we'll see something and we'll make up our minds, boom, like that. On top of that, we tend to really fall victim to the primacy effect. And the primacy effect is we believe our first instinct about another person despite all of the evidence that we see later on. Okay, so let's say that you meet someone and you think that person is a really good person. The first impression you get from that person is really positive, and then later on there's all these red flags that pop up that really tend to show you that this person is not as good of a person as you first thought. We tend to have the primacy effect of, oh, but he or she was so nice when we first met them. That's probably just a weird coincidence. And we tend to fall back to the primacy effect. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe we meet somebody and they come across as a real jerk. And later on, they do some really nice things and some really positive things for other people. But we always go back to, they kind of came across as a jerk. Again, if we have a little bit better perception of ourselves, we'll realize, okay, well, if that person came across as negative, maybe he or she was having a bad day. And now that I've gotten to know them, they're a lot nicer. And so all that kind of goes into the effect of managing our perceptions. And then there's also the negativity bias. So let's say I described you as casual, fun-loving, articulate, and manipulative. Which one of those would you focus on? Now, most people will be, wait a minute, what? You said I was manipulative? Well, I just gave you 3 positive compliments. Why are you focusing on the 1 negative comment I gave you? But that's what we do. We tend to default to the negative in everything. And that's another way that we really have to manage our perceptions about ourselves and others, is not focusing on the negative. Again, because in that example, 3 positives to 1 negative, that would seem to weigh more in the positives, not the negative. But we're going to lock in on, well, you said I was manipulative. That's terrible. Okay, so how can we manage our perceptions? So the first thing is we need to monitor our biases. Okay, if we're making split-second decisions about other people, we need to take a step back and monitor those biases. We also need to make sure that we manage our impressions, both the impressions that we give to others and the impressions, how we take impressions that others give to us. Basically, it's taking a step back and thinking about, okay, are my thoughts really clear on this? Am I taking everything into consideration when I'm making a decision about this other person? What's the context? What's the environment? What's going on at the time? So basically, we need to take a step and manage our first thoughts, our first impressions, and then how we view people's situations and the context behind those situations. And then also we need to be honest with ourselves about our own actions. If we did something good, we need to give ourselves credit. If we did something bad, we need to make sure that we own up to that. And so basically it's a thing of making sure that we're aware of all these misconceptions and wrong perceptions that are out there and taking them for what they are and making intelligent choices as far as how we perceive other people. And probably the most important thing that we need to do in managing our perceptions is practicing empathy. Okay? If you don't know what empathy is basically seeing things from another person's point of view. Okay? Instead of being judgmental towards other people and their situations, we need to put ourselves in that situation and think about, okay, how would I react or how would I feel in this particular situation, and give that other person empathy. And also cut ourselves some slack sometimes and have empathy with ourselves. Really maintaining a healthy sense of empathy in all of our relationships, whether they're personal or professional, that really is important for the health of relationships with others, but also for your own mental health.